Welcome back to another enlightening episode of The Truth About the Plant, the show that takes you on a journey through the world of psychoactive plants and alternative wellness, all while delivering real actionable insights you crave. I'm your host, Christina Dees. This is my equally talented co-host, Dr. Amanda Ryman. We show up each week. We bring you the truth about the plant in 20 minutes or less, sometimes 25, sometimes 15, but we do our best to stay on 20 minutes or less. And Dr. Ryman, why do we show up every week? Why are we so passionate about this?
Well, we're so passionate about this because as cannabis becomes more accessible, legalization continues to happen on a state by state basis in the US and in countries around the world. More people have questions about cannabis. They may not have paid much attention to cannabis. And now all of a sudden there's a dispensary on their corner and their friends are bringing gummies to their game night. And there's questions that people have, very basic questions about the safety of cannabis use, about how to use cannabis effectively, what therapeutic benefits there may be to using cannabis, how to reduce harms and maximize benefits of using this very ancient plant. And unfortunately, cannabis content is not allowed on most social media platforms, even when you're trying to educate people. And if you go online and you try to Google a question, you might get 100 different responses back, and many of those responses will completely contradict each other because everyone out there thinks they're an expert. Well, we are the experts. Believe me, we are the experts. So, we both have training in cannabis. I've been studying cannabis for over 2 decades, and we are here to get through all of the hype and to give you the actionable insights you need in order to make good decisions about your cannabis use. So you can think of us as your really cool aunties or your kick-ass granddaughters, basically the women in your life who will always tell you the truth.
That's right. And have you ever taken a puff and thought, whoa, this is not the weed my parents warned me about? Well, you're not alone. Today, we're going to dive into a viewer question that is lighting up conversations everywhere, which is, why is weed so strong now? This is not your parents' marijuana. So from brickweed to schwag, many of us old enough to remember watching, we're old enough to remember watching Cheech and Chong movies. And we remember the low grade reefer that was used. And it used to come in little small baggies full of seeds. You'd have to pull your seeds out, even stems. The quarter ounce actually cost $25, and you could roll a Bob Marley bomber and just get a mild buzz. I mean, you could smoke this stuff all day and not ever really get high. In today's dispensary marketplace, we see cannabis advertised as being upwards of 30% THC. I mean, the stuff back then was probably 8%. I don't know. It wasn't a lot. And that means that weed is much stronger, but you get a stronger bang for your buck. So why and how has potency increased over the years? And what does that mean for consumption habits and potential risks? I know there's a lot of those. So Dr. Ryman, why is weed so strong now?
Well, yeah. I mean, I remember the brickweed and taking out those seeds and stems. And that wasn't that long ago. We're talking about the mid 90s. So when we think all the way back to the 60s and 70s, where cannabis was kind of coming more into social circles and on the scene in places like college campuses, what you were getting was still cannabis, just like what you're getting today is cannabis. And it wasn't that strong. We didn't exist back then. So, I want to make it clear, stronger cannabis, more potent cannabis is not necessarily a completely modern day invention, right? We definitely had hash plant and other strong cultivars that existed even back then. A huge difference was how available they were. So, yes, if you were a celebrity or you lived in the mountains of a place where there was a landrace strain, or maybe you lived in the Emerald Triangle in California and there were a lot of people that were craft cannabis cultivators, yes, maybe you had access to some of that stronger, more potent cannabis. But most people, just your average everyday Joe people like myself, were not accessing that cannabis. They were accessing cannabis that was being guerrilla farmed a lot of times in Mexico, meaning that a farm was set up way away from civilization. Plants were grown there, not really tended to. Then they were harvested, packaged up as bricks, and shipped somewhere else. And so that was the cannabis that most of us had access to back then. So it wasn't that stronger cannabis didn't exist. It's just that's not what most people were getting. So the prohibition kind of forced this distribution, focusing on efficiency and secrecy. So not only was the product sent in these bricks so that they could mask what it was, they could mask the smell, they could mask the shape. It also would sit in hot places for long periods of time, whether that be on boats or in trucks or in warehouses. And as we've talked about on this show before, light and heat are going to degrade cannabis over time. So even if you had something that started off looking pretty nice when it was harvested, by the time it got to you, which could be 6 months to a year later, it didn't quite look like that. And because of efficiency and trying to pack as much as they possibly could into one container, everything was kind of smushed together. And the other thing that degrades cannabis potency is friction. So pressing buds together, so that, I mean, we used to like peel them off of the brick, right? I mean, they were like 2 dimensional. And so that's also going to degrade potency. Now, something else was happening besides just the way prohibited weed was moving around, which is that post legalization, you started to see a lot more attention being paid to breeding and to cultivation techniques. So things like hydroponic cultivation, experimenting with different lighting, different water, different nutrients, cloning. So taking a plant that had a higher potency and then cloning it as a mother plant and using cuttings in order to replicate that plant. That was much harder to do prior to legalization because, again, people had to do it in secret and there was a big penalty associated with being found out. Now that you have licensed cultivators, they're able to more experiment freely and in the open, trade cultivar seeds with each other, and really breed plants to be much stronger. And they're able to do this on a larger scale. So, one of the things that prohibition did is it kind of trained us on this fallacy that higher THC equals higher quality. When you were purchasing cannabis on the illicit market and you were taking a risk by just purchasing it, right? And you had to go through a lot of hoops in order just to obtain it. If you had something that was really strong, that was the sign of quality. If you had something that was really weak, you were disappointed. And so that's carried over on the consumer side a bit to the modern day legal cannabis market. And so because of that, it's kind of like this never ending cycle, right? Consumers are like, oh, higher THC equals higher quality. So farmers and cultivators are like, oh, consumers want higher potency. So I'm going to try to grow higher potency cannabis. That's what the consumers want. That's what the dispensaries put on their shelves. And it just kind of becomes like this cycle. And that it starts with market demand and then goes back to cultivation techniques and then back across to market demand.
I just am over here smiling because I remember the first time that I saw green weed, because the brickweed used to be brown, right? And I saw green. I'm like, oh, this is what it's supposed to look like. And then it was like, this is what it's supposed to taste like. And so I was actually at a party this past weekend and I smelled brickweed and whipped around and was like, wait, that stuff still exists? Like it's still out there? People smoke it? And sure enough, they were passing around a pinner, and I was like, ew, who wants that? Because like you said, even though it has more THC and it's associated with quality, you are getting fresher stuff than you were back then. So, with alcohol, you can't drink 12 ounces of scotch like you can 12 ounces of beer. Does the same theory, this cannabis, have a bunch of this higher quality stuff, or like because you can't, I mean, you can smoke the other stuff all day long
Right.
and never
Right.
get a high, but whew.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember that too. I mean, I started smoking weed when I lived in Texas in the mid 90s. Like I said, now granted, it was Austin, Texas, which is much more progressive than the rest of the state. But because we were so close to Mexico, that's where a lot of our cannabis was coming from. When I moved back to Chicago, my brother was at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and they used to get like really good cannabis, like real stuff. A lot of their stuff was coming from Vancouver, British Columbia area. And so I would drive the 2 or so hours from Chicago to Madison just so I could get high quality cannabis. And it was also like, something I had never tried before. So, the question is if I have 12 ounces of beer and 12 ounces of scotch, obviously I'm not going to be able to drink the scotch the way I would drink the beer and have the same level of intoxication. The scotch is much higher potency than the beer. When we're talking about kind of lower potency cannabis of yesteryear, versus the higher potency cannabis of today, there's a lot of similarities there. You're definitely going to get more intoxicated if you're used to smoking a joint that's 15% and then you smoke one that's 30%, right? So that analogy of going from beer to liquor, you're going to feel that. But unlike alcohol, you're not going to get sick from the higher potency, right? So I might say, well, I'm not going to drink 12 ounces of scotch because I'm going to throw up and I'm going to be so hungover the next day and I might get alcohol poisoning. I'm going to stick with the beer. And so that is not true with cannabis. So, when you're choosing higher potency cannabis, you might get more intoxicated, but the level of risk in smoking a 30% THC joint versus a 15% THC joint is not the same in drinking 12 ounces of scotch versus 12 ounces of beer. So it's really more, do you like the higher level of intoxication? Do you enjoy the higher potency product? But also, unlike alcohol, THC tolerance can build up fairly quickly. And it also varies quite a bit from person to person due to our endocannabinoid system functioning. So some people have always been able to consume higher potency cannabis products and not feel super intoxicated or not have any negative side effects. Other people just aren't able to do that. So, that is also going to be a difference between something like a 7%, you were saying, back in the day versus like a 30% today. Some people aren't going to be able to handle how strong cannabis is that they're finding in the dispensary today.
Yeah, my problem is I actually enjoy smoking a joint. There's just something about it. But nowadays, it's like just take one hit and you're good. And it's so hard to take one hit and then put it out versus being able to just sit back and enjoy, or, with a friend too. I don't want to get that high. So, how do you think all of this affects consumption patterns?
Well, real quick, just based on what you just said, that was a real issue. People wanted to smoke a joint, but they weren't able to smoke the whole thing because it was so potent. And let's face it, relighting half a joint after you've put it out does not taste good. Right? The cannabis has been exposed to air. It's been burnt at the end. It just isn't a great experience. And so we started to see in the marketplace things like dog walkers, right? Which are teeny tiny joints, with the idea that it only was maybe 3 or 4 hits and you could finish the whole thing. And so the market really responded to this idea that not everybody wanted to smoke a gigantic joint. Now, I remember back in the day, we used to roll huge joints and pass them around and we were able to finish them no problem. So, your question about consumption patterns, research does suggest that people self titrate when they're using more potent cannabis. So instead of taking 4 hits, they might take 1 or 2. Now, on the one hand, this is good, right? Because we don't want people smoking as much. We want them to smoke as little as possible. And if I'm able to get the effect I'm looking for after taking 1 or 2 puffs off the pre roll versus 4 or 5 puffs off the pre roll, that's going to reduce the amount of smoking. But as tolerance starts to build, 1 or 2 hits may become 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 without a big change in intoxication. So you kind of have to be aware that if you're like, well, I'm going to smoke higher potency cannabis so that I'm smoking less, if you do that regularly, you might creep up there because of your tolerance. So if someone takes a break from cannabis, their tolerance is going to drop. And then they may go back down to only needing 1 or 2 for a while until it creeps back up again.
Well, you mentioned, 33% THC. I've seen products boasting over 40% THC. Is that a real thing? Like, I don't even know if you can get 40% THC from flower. It's really,
Yeah, it's very unlikely. It's
yeah.
very unlikely. So we've definitely seen those kinds of products out here in California. We do know in California there are issues with what we call lab shopping, meaning that because the consumer wants higher potency, and so the stores feel that higher potency cannabis is more valuable, so that's what they want to stock. A farmer's going to want to come in and say, "Oh, this is 40% THC," because then the store's like, "Wow," and the consumer's like, "Wow." But it probably isn't.
Yeah.
So THC is an oil that's housed in the trichome heads of the plant. So, the trichome heads, these little mushroom shaped, and at the top of that mushroom, that's where the THC oil is. So when we're talking about THC percentage, we're talking about the percent of the plant that is THC. So if almost half of the plant is THC oil, first of all, it wouldn't really have a shape. Second of all, it'd be very hard to grind up and actually light on fire and keep sustained on fire. So it's not very user friendly. So while I understand the marketing behind 40% THC, it's very unlikely that what you have in front of you is actually 40% THC. Because most of the weight of the plant is going to be the plant matter itself. It's going to be the buds and it's going to be all of the other components of the plant and not just the oil that's in those little trichome heads. So 25% THC or 20 to 25% seems to be kind of the sweet spot right now between potency and usability, meaning that it's a highly potent plant, but it still is able to be broken up and lit on fire and sustain the burn so that people can enjoy consuming it. But for a lot of people, even 25 or 20% THC is too strong.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because 18% I found is my sweet spot. And I was in Oregon and dispensary shopping to try to find it again. I think I just got like a little sample of it. A friend of mine owns a dispensary, and I was like, "Oh, that's what I'm looking for. That's what I want." And it is turns out really hard to find anything under 25%. You can maybe get lucky and find a 22, 23%, but the 18% is really, really hard. So I know it can be tough to find lower THC cannabis flower in dispensaries. So if I'm someone who doesn't want to use edibles and I do want to smoke flower, what do I do?
Well, you are absolutely right about that. And this is a conundrum, especially for newer consumers. So, when cannabis was first legalized in a state, a lot of the people that were coming to dispensaries were not new consumers. They were current consumers. So, these were people that had already been consuming cannabis under prohibition, and their tolerances were sizable, right? So, they were looking for higher potency flower. And because of that, farmers were growing higher potency flower. And stores really weren't taking in flower that was lower potency. I can remember when I worked for a cannabis distributor in California and we were trying to get flower into dispensaries, they would regularly say, we don't take anything that's under 20%. And that's one of the reasons why we have the lab shopping issue, right? Is because people are like, hey, if this flower doesn't test at least 20%, I'm not going to be able to get it into a store. What's it going to take for you to say that my flower is 20%? And so that has become an issue. Now we have more people now coming into dispensaries that are newer consumers, especially in states that didn't have very big consumer bases prior to legalization. So I'm thinking about places like Missouri and Ohio. It's not that these places didn't have cannabis consumers, but when you look at the consumption rate of, say, Missouri versus California, you had a lot more cannabis consumers in California prior to legalization. So the people coming into dispensaries in states now are not seasoned consumers. They're newer consumers and they want lower potency products. That's why the hemp beverage market has taken off so much, because a lot of those hemp beverages that people are buying outside of dispensaries in places like Wine and More and other beverage stores are low potency, meaning that they have 2 milligrams of THC, maybe 5 milligrams of THC, sometimes 1 milligram of THC. And for newer consumers, that's what they like. But not everybody wants a beverage. Some people want to smoke. Now, a lot of newer consumers aren't into the smoking, but that doesn't mean none of them are. And older consumers, they may be looking to use this therapeutically. And as we've talked about, smoking, even though it has its risks, is one of the most effective ways to feel the effects right away and to be able to properly titrate your dose. This is my suggestion. My suggestion is to buy some hemp flower, which is under 0.3% THC. It's federally legal. You can buy it online, and then mix it with the flower you get from the dispensary. So just kind of like mixing water with your liquor dilutes the drink, so that you have more liquid, but it's not as potent. Same thing. So if I get 20% THC flower from the dispensary, then I get THC free hemp flower and I make a mix with it, then the resulting pre-roll is going to be less potent than 20% THC. And you can maybe enjoy the whole joint without getting as high. However, as we've talked about on this show, you should go check out our episode on hemp-derived cannabinoids. Just because it says hemp flower does not mean it does not contain high amounts of THC. So it could have high amounts of THCA. And we have another show on the difference between THC and THCA. THCA basically is non-intoxicating. It is considered federally legal-ish, but once you light it on fire, it becomes THC. So you could have hemp flower that's 20% THCA classified as hemp, but then when you light that on fire in a joint, it becomes 20% THC flower. There's also hemp flower out there that's been sprayed with Delta 9 THC. So it's technically hemp flower, but it does have THC in it. So you really want to make sure that what you buy is THC free, or that it doesn't have any THCA in it. It's basically going to be a CBD flower. And then you're going to be able to mix that with your high THC flower and make your own blend.
See, this is why we're the cool aunties and the kick-ass granddaughters who always shoot you straight, because we're going to tell you like it is. But Dr. Ryman, are there any risks to consuming highly potent products? So like you mentioned, you could accidentally, think that you're buying THCA, for example, and light it on fire and woof, you're going to get 25% once you light it. I know some states are considering capping the amount of THC for that reason, just for safety. So are there any risks?
Well, I would say in the immediate term, I mean, the risk is that you get too high, right? So we have an episode on THC overdose. If you want to check that out, it talks all about what that is and what to do if you experience that. It's not going to be dangerous, but it can be uncomfortable and anxiety provoking. So in the moment, the risk is that you get too high. And this could just be, I got too high and now I'm anxious. I got too high and now I'm uncomfortable. Or it can be, I got too high and now I can't go pick my kid up from school because I can't drive. Or I got too high and I was supposed to have this work call and now I can't do it. So, there's definitely some risks in becoming more intoxicated than you want to be in that moment. Now, long term, honestly, we don't know. I mean, there doesn't seem to be negative outcomes for people who consume occasionally, meaning a few times a week or less. However, for people that are consuming high potency products very regularly, meaning several times a day for years and years, we are seeing rises in things like cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which is cyclical vomiting. And they're not really sure what causes it, but they think it might be some kind of misfiring of the ECS related to ingestion of very large amounts of high potency cannabis. As you know, cannabis has been used as an anti-nausea agent, but what happens if that signaling becomes reversed? And instead of anti-nausea, every time you consume cannabis, you get nauseous and you throw up. So that's something that we're still investigating. I will say that we do have an endocannabinoid system. We all do. We do have cannabinoid receptors running through our bodies, including high concentrations in our brains. And we don't yet know what the long-term impacts are of hammering these receptors consistently with high levels of THC. So, people might say, well, people have been consuming cannabis for thousands of years. And, people have been consuming cannabis regularly since the 60s and they all seem fine. Well, first of all, anecdotal evidence is not evidence. And second of all, for a great large part of their cannabis consuming history, they were consuming 10% THC products, right? So even though high potency products have always existed, the accessibility of high potency products to the general population is still a relatively new phenomenon. So we're really not going to know what the effects are of consuming 30% THC or THC concentrates, which can be, 60, 70, 80% through dabbing or through vape pens multiple times a day for 30, 40, 50 years until down the road. Right? That's not something we're able to tell at this point because we just haven't had enough people who have had access to those products for long enough to see what the long-term effects are. I'll also say that the effect and the outcome may not be the same for everyone. So we do understand that when there's a therapeutic need for cannabis, there is some kind of signaling going on that the cannabinoids are either interrupting or facilitating. So somebody that's using cannabis, say for a chronic neurological pain condition, they may not have the same outcomes related to high potency THC as somebody who doesn't have those medical issues. I'll just say for myself, again, anecdotal evidence. When I've had back surgery, knee surgery, other surgeries where I have pain afterwards, I used or have used very high doses of THC, like 200 milligrams at a time under the tongue in tincture form several times a day. And yes, it absolutely managed my pain so that I didn't need to take opiates, but I didn't get high from it. Now, if I were to use that same dose when I didn't have pain and I was just Amanda sitting here in my chair, I would get really intoxicated. So we haven't really been able to parse out whether the effects on the body, the brain long term are different for people that are using cannabis for a specific therapeutic purpose versus people that are using it more for a fun or recreational or kind of quasi therapeutic purpose. So, unfortunately, as we've discussed on this show, the inability to do human studies with cannabis limits what we can find out right now.
Yeah, well, it sounds like this is where the minimum effective dose and tolerance breaks come in, which we talk about a lot on this show. It's sort of the one of the reasons that we do what we do here, because we want to help people with dosage, and understanding what you need to do, because you build a tolerance and you do need to take a break.
Well, absolutely. As we've mentioned on this show, you should always be focused on consuming the smallest amount of cannabis possible while still getting the effect you want. Now, that's kind of like stopping eating once you are full. Definitely easier said than done. And I'm guilty of that. It's like, oh, I'm full, but I still have 10 French fries on my plate. I'm not going to let those go to waste. And so I think we've all had that experience. And we've all had the experience of consuming cannabis, smoking weed, and being like, I'm pleasantly high. And then being like, but maybe I want to be more high, and consuming more. So again, that goes back to that mindfulness of how do I feel right now, and really thinking about stopping once you feel good. We've talked about tolerance breaks. So even 48 hours can help you keep that minimum effective dose low. And, again, if you have access to it, I would suggest trying a lower potency flower if you can find it. Many people report they get just as high from 17% THC as they do from 27% THC. And sometimes the numbers create a placebo effect. So you're like, oh, 27%, that's 10% higher. I'm 10% higher as a result. But it's really just suggestive, right? It's suggestive that this is stronger, therefore I should feel higher. But they have done some studies where they basically blind people and then have them try different potencies. And people do not report being significantly higher with higher potency cannabis once you get beyond like 15%.
I believe it. Yeah. Well, I think we have to wrap this up. We're at 28 minutes, so let's put a wrap on today's high-powered chat. If you've ever wondered why grandma's weed isn't quite the same as what's on shelves today, well, now you know. So, but hey, don't let that stop the curiosity train. Again, we always love our questions from our audience. You never know when your question will make it on the show, so you can always drop us a line, info@mypersonalplants.com. And even more, check out our YouTube garden. Lots of episodes there. Subscribe, like, tap the notification bell so you stay in the loop. You can find us on all the podcast platforms. Maybe you're listening to that right now. So until next time, stay grounded, stay curious, and remember, potency isn't everything. It's all about the balance. We'll see you next time. Trying to find the stop button.